teams actually, thanks everyone for actually joining this debate as well. Can I have a round of applause again, one again for the debaters, please? Okay, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open his speech, please. Please, sir.
In the history of modern sporting events, not a single one has ever turned a profit for its host nation. China is dismantling its iconic bird nest stadium. South Africa lost billions of rand in the construction of the Gauteng transport project. And the British people did not get the millions of pounds in profit they were promised. Today on Side Proposition, we reject the placement of international sporting events within the developing world. We are going to be using three criteria to analyze this debate. Firstly, harms to developing countries. Secondly, harms to international sporting events. And lastly, harms to international relations. In terms of definitions, we define an international sporting event as any kind of event involving selection and international participation. In this case, most likely events like the Olympics and World Cups in various sports. In terms of developing countries, we're talking primarily about BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, the people who are currently hosting big international sporting events. However, we feel anyone who is still considered a third world country falls into this category. In terms of case splits, I will be addressing the first criteria, harms to developing nations, in terms of economic and social harms. I will then be addressing the second criteria of harms to sporting events. My second speaker, Jake, will then deal with the third criteria of harms to international relations. So let's firstly look at harms to developing countries. And the first harm we have to look at is economic harm. And the conclusion I'll be reaching in this point is that putting international sporting events within developing countries economically harms the people of that country in both the short and long term. So let's firstly look at the short term harm. And I think what we're dealing with here primarily is the cost. So why do international sporting events cost so much money? Well, we think before the games start, we have countries like South Africa having to build, the infrastructure necessary for those sports. So huge stadiums being built. We also think that we need to build entire transport networks to deal with the amounts of people flooding your country and trying to get to those different sporting facilities. During the games, we have huge amounts of money being put into things like opening ceremonies. Why? Because there's a pressure to make those ceremonies very good. London spent £40 million, no thank you, on its opening ceremony alone. Then we've got the post-game costs in terms of maintenance of stadiums. So why are these costs bad in the short term? Well, we think there's a direct opportunity cost involved. When it comes to developing countries, we don't think they have an abundance of money. That means that putting large amounts of money into no thank you infrastructure means that they are not putting that money into helping desperate people within their societies, people who are struggling to access their basic socioeconomic rights. On top of that, we think that even if there isn't an opportunity cost, putting the money into infrastructure means that we are shifting our focus to the wrong place. When we've got suffering people in a society, this House rejects putting money into something which is not necessary, when in fact we should be helping the people who are suffering. So that's the short-term costs. In terms of long-term, what we'd like to look at, and I'll take you in a second, sir, is the focus of the government on development. But I'll address that directly after this POI. Yes, sir.
Now, this infrastructure built for international sporting events can also be utilized by the local people and therefore benefit them.
Sir, yes, we agree that sort of a sports stadium can be utilized, but we just don't think that what's necessary is to build these extravagant stadiums. We don't think that's what local populations need. Moreover, what we respond to is the fact that when you create that kind of infrastructure, you end up wasting it. We'd like Side Opposition to address how the local population of China is using the swimming cube when it is currently in the process of being converted into a construction site because they're demolishing it. Or their stadium, which they're also demolishing due to maintenance costs. We don't think that that POI stands in today's debate. So, no thank you, Madam Responsible. So let's look at the long-term benefits, or rather long-term harms economically. And what we see here is that the main issue is the focus of the government on development. So why is government focused on development important? What we see is that development is an incredibly hard process to try and encourage. We see that many countries struggle to get from a state of being third world into a state of development and improving the quality of life of their people. In order to do this, we think the government needs to be focusing solely on that kind of thing. We think government needs to be putting its attention and its money onto trying to encourage development, trying to encourage its country to grow. So why don't we get that focus in this situation? Well, what we see is that when we host an international sporting event, government gains a lot of favor. It gains favor from its people, and it gains favor from the international community. However, both of these are a superficial kind of favor. There's something which benefits a government because it likes popularity, but not something that really benefits the country as a whole. No, thank you. Why is this bad? What we think this is a kind of reward for a government which doesn't involve its focusing on its people, doesn't involve on focusing or any kind of real change it has to make for its country. What we think happens when you create this kind of incentive structure is that it means governments are encouraged to take action which doesn't really help, but still get the same kind of reward in terms of focus. On those grounds, we think international sporting events distract the focus of governments away from development. And that is the long-term harm we're talking about. So now, with economic harm shown, both short-term and long-term, let's look at social harm. And the conclusion here is that international sporting events are very bad for the societies of the countries in which they're hosted. Why? Well, we think there are two things. Firstly, very realistically during games, we think there is a huge desire to impress the international community. What happens when we've got this desire? Well, a situation like we saw when the 1980 Olympics was hosted in Barcelona, where what we got was Barcelona rounding up poor people living on its streets, rounding up people living in slums, and moving them out of the city. Basically a violation of rights, very primarily just because they want to impress. And we've seen this happen across the world in various different sporting events. However, we also think what we get is a promotion of societal inequality and lack of cohesiveness. Why? Because there's an inequality during games. During these kind of sporting events, things are very expensive. The games themselves are expensive to go to in terms of ticket prices, because they're catering to people who are outside of the country, and other things like restaurants bump up their prices. What does this mean? We think it means that poor people can't enjoy the kind of things rich people can. Poor people can't see the sports, can't go to games, while the rich people in society can enjoy those kind of privileges. As a result of this, we think we create polarization. We think poor people get angry that they can't enjoy these kind of things while they're in their country, and rich people are elevated above the normal society. So, on those grounds, we get significant harm. But moreover, we think there's harm to sporting events. We think that they are not able to provide the same quality of sports in terms of the game. Why is this? Well, we think there are two reasons. One is the quality of their technology. We don't think they're able to promote technology and provide technology which is as good. Firstly, in terms of viewing, like camera technology, and secondly, in terms of monitoring and those kind of equipment, like staff line equipment. Why? Simply speaking, because of cost. We think the lack of access to these kind of technologies means that games are worse quality. But then the most important harm here is the fans, because we think that's where the primary cost of sport happens when we host in developing nations. Developing nations are firstly far away from the primary people who like to attend them. We think that whether you're talking about Brazil or Africa, you're far away from the primary people who enjoy it, people in Europe. That means that they're not going to go. Moreover, they don't desire to travel. Why is that? Well, because they don't think it's safe, or isn't safe. In either case, the fans whose sport is for are not able to attend the games which they want to see. So, on side of the proposition, we're left defending the developing world who doesn't get benefits but rather is harmed by international sporting events. Moreover, we defend those sporting events ourselves. We are proud.
Can everyone hear me?
Teacher, is this 8 minutes speech?
Yeah, 8 minutes, sorry. Yeah.
There is an immense sense of national pride whenever a country gets the right to host an event. We think that we deny a country the ability to host an event just because you're labeled developing is insanely abhorrent, its very core. But our model today will be very simple. Two ideas. As long as you're qualified and have a certain level of competency, and as long as you want to have it, you should be able to compete on a fair ground and get a chance to do it. You're going to go by standard procedures on how we determine which country will be able to host which event. First of all, as usual, you have to submit your bid documents to the international organization related to that sporting event. And once that's done, they will send people to review that country and review the capability of the country in terms of being able to accommodate a number of guests and tourists and that kind of things, and also transport systems. This is what they had done inside the Youth Olympics in 2010, where they went to all these countries to see where they have the base level of competency. It's not being the most magnificent, but at least allowing a certain level of being able to carry out the event. Finally, there's a voting process where members who are participants inside the international organization will cast their votes and finally determine which, from the shortlisted candidates, which country should host the event. The idea here is clear. It's a fair competition in a sense because even developing countries can participate. We're saying that as long as you want to, you're willing to spend a bit of resources here and there, and as long as you have a certain level of competency, you should be able to participate, such as Brazil in 2016. They're a great country and they still get the right to vote. Even also, the final part is, once you're selected, the country will have to work hand in hand with the international organizations. Officials will be sent out to regulate and check the progress, and any shortcomings will be remedied. It doesn't matter whether you're developing or developed, this is standard procedure in any competition. This is a model, very clear, just to get things settled for now. Now, a few rebuttals now. Now, the first idea is on economic loss. They like to tell us that when every single sporting event has turned up a loss. We challenge this idea. It may seem like you're making a loss because the initial investment in that event may seem huge and may seem to take a toll on the country, but the potential profit which you get from the event is something that is there and something they do get. How are we talking about economic progress? First of all, the event itself is a powerful surge in market activity in the country. We have tourists coming in dozens to visit the country. They contribute to the local markets there. We also have huge media attention and broadcasting revenue coming into the country. Even more so, it reaches familiarity because international events like this expose the country to everyone else. And this is good because investors are more likely to invest in a country which they deem they are familiar with. Finally, in terms of jobs experience, the event itself requires jobs which are specialized in nature. This trains the locals and gives them the necessary skills to be able to work inside these future sporting events or to be able to have certain jobs over there. Because the manpower needed is there, and what developing countries need is to use that manpower efficiently. The idea is that all these things trickle down to the people in a sense. You may be bombarded with statistics of how about lost millions of dollars and such, but ultimately, countries, when they choose to host the events, they make a calculated and rational decision. How much am I willing to lose and how much am I willing to gain? It's never going to be done in a stupid way because all these things, when the government takes into their mind, will all be for the benefit of the country. No, thank you. But finally, because they're developing and growing so fast, the loss will often be offset. Now, the funny idea is here. Have you ever heard of a country which went broke after hosting an international sporting event? Is it a developing country or a developed country? The only one I can name is Greece, which was a developed country. This already shows you that the label of developed and developing has no play on how much economic loss will be suffered by a country. In fact, countries like South Africa and China have huge economic gain. The challenge idea is economic loss. But before I go on, yes.
So why, if there's such great benefit during the time of the sports, did British people complain that their shops weren't making any money and that they lost billions and the government spent way too much hosting the games? So
it's all very dependent. In certain cases, certain people may be upset because the tourist attention is somewhere else. But the idea remains the same, that in general, more people in the country means more expenditure and more money coming into the country. In general, society is helped. The second idea is about social problems and about governments such as Barcelona infringing on people's rights and moving them out of the way. Here's the thing. These things, when they do happen, is it better to expose them through the use of international event or to keep it hidden? Because with these international events, such as you see in China, when these things do happen, there's intense media scrutiny on their actions. But we see that when China chooses to round up people and push them to one side, we scrutinize them, we criticize them. And this is necessary because developing countries, if they do have this kind of mentality, they need international pressure to form and mold this mentality into a way that's beneficial to them in the end. We need to sway the way they carry out the procedure, and you can't do it if you're always locking them away and preventing them from hosting these events. And finally, this idea that the people who best enjoy these games will find it especially tough because it's not safe or it's too far away from them. And I say that this is ridiculous. Because ultimately, if you really love the game, you're going to go there anyway. Safety is not a matter because you're always working hand in hand with international organization. We think these all trivial matters. What really matters is what we're going to tell you right now. First of all, the argument will be such. I'll tell you why the term developed and developing country is never a good way to measure the capability of the country to host the event. And my second speaker will tell you about the idea of sports and what should it really be about. First of all, what's a developing country? A developed country is a country with fast economic growth, it's new to the international economy, it has rapid development structure and such. But what's the criteria by which we pick which country will host the international sporting event? First of all, the idea of basic competence. As long as you have the ability to accommodate this much of people, you have a decent transport system, you'll be in the running to host the event. But even more so, we don't choose countries just because you have magnificent structure. More often than not, we like to see the culture of the country and expose the culture of the country. And we also like to be inclusive. We were extremely proud when we had finally a first Asian country, China, hosting the Olympics in 2008. It was a great surge of pride, and that was considered a developing country. Even more so, the pride we had when South Africa held the World Cup in 2010 was immense. It was considered one of the best World Cups, not because it had the best structure ever, but because we saw a side of the world that most people could never see. And this is why sports is especially important, because sports exposes us to different things and different cultures. If you're always going to limit it to the developed world, we're going to lose out on a significant part of sports. But before I go on, any of you guys are really quiet. Okay, if not, let's continue on. So this is where it comes in. Automatically labeling a country developing and saying you should not host the event is flawed. Yes, why not?
Our objection is not to the fact that countries don't have the structure, but rather to the fact that in exposing the world's slackless culture, you ended up taking billions away from the poor people, which they didn't make back when people went to spend money on shops. So
that's not the case. The poor people to a certain extent still benefited. These are the same poor people who set up small markets and such inside the place, and when you have tourists visiting the country, they do benefit. These are the same people who need the exposure, but you don't think that it's necessarily disenfranchising poor people. No, thank you. So the idea here is that we don't just value the infrastructure of the country, we also value the uniqueness that the country provides, and we're only going to get a good sporting event if this country has the ability to showcase this kind of culture to the world, and not just limit it to developed countries. Even if stability and infrastructure is a big deal, it can still be guaranteed. We see that in most cases, just because you're a developing country doesn't mean you're terrible and you're disenfranchising the poor. In cases where Greece held the Olympics in 2004, they still had the same problem stated over here. Just because you're a developing country, it doesn't mean that the harms are exclusive to you. Because most of these countries have huge economic growth and are more than capable of hosting these events. You'll need to defend then how developed countries are not also prone to the same problems you experience, such as the poor getting disenfranchised and such. We're just being on equal grounds here and saying that in terms of equality, everyone has the same amount of problems, everyone has the same things to deal with. It's just a matter of, do you really want to deserve? Do you really deserve it? So conclusion to this argument is clear. The labels of developing and developed countries have little impact on how we value which country to choose the event. Even more so, we think it's abhorrent to deny a country the right to host this event and tell, because you are a developing country, you're not going to get the ability to host this event. Because there's a unique sense of national pride, and when everyone bonds together to be able to host this event, it's something that's once in a lifetime, and limiting to developed countries is not the way to go about it. Governments essentially will always choose choices which are best for their people. It may seem like a lot, but it's not the case. We're very proud to oppose.
Roll for 8 minutes and 24 seconds, 8:24. Like to thank the decision, I invite Deputy Prime Minister for the case of government side, please.
We on opposition side are proud to believe, defend and support that developing countries should not host international sporting events. I will be talking more about the third criteria of hosting these international sporting events, which is that it harms the international relationship. But before I talk and explain more further, I would like to rebut the previous speaker. The previous speaker talks about that. He says that these countries would have to bid for these, to host to these international competitions. But then I say, when they bid, it's bad competition. There will be tensions between these countries. For when they bid, they would go on to host these countries, and then therefore there will be a hostility. It also says that there will be economic progress when these developing countries host these international sporting events. But then it's only the economic progress will only be short term. Like when the tourists come for these international sporting events, it's only short term for that only reason. reason that there is a sporting event. But then they sit down. But then they won't come back again for that sporting event because then in the future there won't be any more. He also said this economic progress is also short term because the stadiums being built for these certain sports will only be for that event, and then in the future there won't be any use. Let's look at the case of China, of the Olympics of China. The China hosted the Olympics. When China hosted the Olympics, they built all these fancy stadiums. But then in the future, sit down. But then right now, these fancy stadiums don't have any use anymore. The China right now is having a hard time maintaining these stadiums, and then they are also proposing a solution of destroying these stadiums. The previous speaker, yes.
But this is the same problem that goes with developed countries, and developed countries don't have the same kind of economic progress and surge of growth to offset this kind of costs.
Yeah, but then you're talking about these developing countries and economic progress. It's like when they host these, it is short term only. Is that he also said that there will be a social problem, but then these poor people, they don't make any of these money. They're not benefiting at all. He also said that there will be that these developing countries should host it, but when these developing countries host, there will be a further inequality between the rich and the poor. But then because we also have to bridge. The government's role has to bridge these rich and the poor, and it's their responsibility to help cover the gap. He also says that when they host these international competitions, there will be that the money will also go to the fundings of these stages. But then the money should go to better places than these. The government is the government's responsibility to prioritize much more better things, such as poverty in their certain country, since it is a developing country, and agriculture and much more other departments, not only to the sporting events. Now I would like to go to my first argument. Now for my first argument is that there will be neo-colonialism, which is a spread of influence using indirect power, basically indirect colonialism. There is a spread of influence politically and then towards the people. How does this happen? This happens when European nations or countries, much more stronger than the developing countries, try to influence these developing countries. Therefore, in the long term, these developing countries will then always root for a certain strong European nation which has influenced them. Is that when they spread their influence down, when they spread these influences, it will be politically and by the people. This will be done when the developing because there will be a bad for the developing countries as a whole and bad for the international body, for it harms not only the international relations, but also the citizens of this developing country as a whole. Yes.
So if I somehow independently tried to create an international sporting event, then I'll suddenly become like a slave of another Western country.
No, we're not saying that, not necessarily a slave, that they will be an influence. That like for an example, like when Britain, when they influence a certain country, that there will be an indirect colonialism, that when this certain developing country will then always want to root for Britain, and that this small developing country will then always be like their little Britain, and that Britain will always root for them, and that there will be tensions between the countries, the neighboring countries of this developing country. Is that neocolonialism will also affect long term will have a bad effect and a negative effect long term to the developing country. For then the developing country would want to be more independent, would have a sense of national pride, and that when neocolonialism comes in, neocolonialism comes in, they are not having the freedom and experience of experiencing other of experiencing their certain national pride anymore. For when a European power is trying to, much more bigger country is trying to develop them, it's not anymore.
Neo-colonialism can also happen when you say you are a developing country, you do not have the right to host this event, you'll always be subservient to us. Doesn't that happen too?
Yeah, but what we're saying is that neo-colonialism is that in the country is that there will be there will be a power in the long term. There will be a power balance, a shift of balance of power. That this will cause tensions between the strong nations, which then might lead to a long-term disagreements and arguments between the strong nations. Now, in my second argument of the third criteria of that there will be a problem with international stability. That there will be a creation of tensions between the neighboring countries. That there will be a stigma of benefits. An example I can give is that an example of South Africa hosting the FIFA World Cup. But when they hosted the FIFA World Cup, there was been a tensions between its neighboring countries, its neighboring countries in Africa. When they hosted it, there has been the spotlight has been shifted to only South Africa, and that the other whole world is not only minding South Africa, not these other nations. Then these other nations, these neighboring nations, are then getting mad at that, are causing tensions with South Africa because they are getting shunned, and South Africa is then gaining all the somewhat fame and doing of hosting these international sporting events. These international sporting events also then their bidding will cause bad competition between these countries. But then, because if there's bad competition, we then lead to regional tension between the bordering neighboring nations, which is then an example is the South Africa hosting these FIFA International World Cup. But then, therefore, we on the opposition side are proud to defend and believe that these developing countries should not host these international sporting events. Thank you.
Over 8 minutes and 38 seconds. 8:38. I'd like to thank Deputy Prime Minister for his speech, and I invite Deputy Leader Mr. Gisborne to come, please.
Sorry.
Everybody hear me? We think that it is abhorrent for you to limit this right, or to say that developing countries should not host international sporting events merely because they are developing. We see that from first speaker from side opposition. We told you the economic benefits that these nations will receive. We don't think that these benefits and this argumentation has been properly rebutted by second speaker from their side. And therefore, we think those economic benefits still stand in today's debate. But furthermore, he brings up this idea about international relations and how neo-colonialism will exist under the paradigm where developing nations will host these events. Yet he never explained to me properly how exactly why do they want to host international sporting events for, say, European countries if they do not receive benefits at the end of the day. But before I move on to my arguments about the spirit of sport and how allowing developing countries to hold international sporting events, it will allow exposure of cultures and traditions of these developing countries to the world. I would like to state some about those. on the first rebuttal, on the idea of economic harms brought up by first speaker. They talk about a lot of investment has to be put in and how infrastructure after being built will not be able to be used by the people. My first speaker told you about how there will be more tourists, about that there will be familiarity and media coming into the countries. We don't think it has been budget from side proposition. The only thing coming up about tourists is that, well, tourists will come only once and then they will not come again. We don't think this is the case. This is when my first speaker talked to you about familiarity. If they come to a country like South Africa, if they like the country, then they probably want to come back again. Then they want to explore the cultures. They want to spend their time there so that because of their love for that particular culture. And that is why we think they will still also come back. But furthermore, the idea of media attention and familiarity is the idea that when these countries are exposed on an international level, then you bring in foreign investment. Then you see that these countries, there are many areas that are possible for investment to be made, and therefore foreign investment in coming. And that's another economic benefit that these developing nations will receive. Furthermore, saying that infrastructure cannot be used by people isn't necessarily always the case. Because when you want to host an international sporting event, you not only view infrastructure, you renovate the already existing infrastructure. You make sure you build proper roads, you make sure you build proper transportation, and these are areas that people later on can benefit after the international sporting event has been done. And because of these reasons, even the poor can benefit from this transportation process, and we don't think that these benefits are only exclusive to the rich people like what they told us. But furthermore, right, they talk about how money should be used to alleviate poverty. We agree, poverty, that is something that should be alleviated. But we think that on the very first level, the government already does so in the status quo. But secondly, we think that allowing developing nations to host international sporting event actually help the poor people. Why? Because when you bring in media attention, then this problem of poverty can be addressed at an international level. The charity or the Red Cross, they can see that there are areas in those countries that need attention, that they need more donations, so that these people at the end of the day will be sympathized and that more money can be generated to help these people. And that's why we think it will also help them solve poverty. But furthermore, look at the second rebuttal on the idea of social harm. They talk about because there's a huge desire to impress the international community, then you will then violate human rights. We don't support violation of human rights, but we say that by hosting international sporting event, this type of violation will be addressed on international level. That there will be international pressure for them to tell them that there is actually a right way for you to host an international sporting event, and that is a benefit from our side. That is something that the third speaker from their side must respond to. But furthermore, right, they talk about how the technology, on the third rebuttal, they talk about how technology isn't sufficient, therefore you shouldn't host it. We think that in very first place, if you want to host an international sporting event, you already have to invest into infrastructure, into technology. But also, my first speaker told you how it isn't sometimes only about technology. It is also about culture. It is also about the fact that your country is unique in a certain way. It isn't only because your country is the most technologically advanced country. But also, right, we told you that if you actually host, that at the end of the day, you actually have an incentive for the country to invest more into that technology. Because otherwise, when will this technology be further advanced in the future? Because we recognize that later on, this technology has to be invested in anyway. So by allowing them to host, it will actually create an incentive for them to create a better technology that at the end of the day will be accessible by all sectors in the society. But before I move on,
so we would prefer the developing world, which has millions of poor people, to spend its money on helping those poor people grow, not on investing in expensive technology because it needs to fulfill some kind of international pressure to have good sport.
Firstly, I told you about how infrastructure can also help the poor people, but furthermore, the economic benefits that you earn after hosting an international sporting event, the revenue that you get, can also be used to help the poor. And they talk about charity. We think that already proves that the poor will also be helped under our side. And on the fourth and last rebuttal, on the idea of neo-colonialism. Firstly, we don't think they give a sufficient reason why you want to then host a country for another country, because if at the end of the day you don't receive benefits, then you probably don't want to do it for another country. Because we tell you the reason why they want to do it, because this is a national pride, that they want to do it because they want to expose their cultures to the world, and that is the reason why they want to do it for themselves and not for other countries. And moving on to my argument. Allowing international sporting events to be held by developing countries protects the essence of sport and rectify the misconception on developing nations. The principle of this argument is that about the spirit of the sport. On the first level, limiting the right only to developed countries takes away the essence of sport. Because sport is compelling because it's an area where humans forget about their differences and focus on the communality the love for sport, where they overcome national barrier, where they overcome language barrier, and they together celebrate the achievement of mankind. However, this essence of sport will be lost under divisive mentality. That the sport is no longer about unity, but it's about that if you are developing, then you shouldn't force it. That there are other areas that you should focus on. And at the end of the day, we think that because in the very first place, the idea of whether something is whether a country is developed or developing, in the very first place, is somehow ambiguous. And because of this reason, the essence of sport will be gone. Because you only think that only developed countries are capable. When my first speaker already told you that this isn't always the case. But furthermore, on the second level, allowing developing countries to host exposes their cultures to the world. Because the way you run an international sporting event reflects your culture. We give you an example of China's Olympic in 2008. The opening ceremony allows the world to see the history and the cultures and traditions of China. The exposure allows the countries to see and understand. They break down the ethnocentric barriers, and thus they understand Chinese values more. The point is, having people seeing your cultures is better than than not seeing the cultures of China at all. But more importantly, cultures and traditions unite local people. Is this their national pride to host international sporting events and show the world that their country can do and they are capable of running a decent event. But furthermore, we give the example of what happened in London Olympics, where 70,000 people volunteered to help. And the reason why they volunteered to help, because they are proud that their country has the opportunity to host an international sporting event. And because hosting an international sporting event is a national pride, because it unites people, we think developing nations should also host international sporting events. But on my last level, on the last and third level, how international sporting events are a platform for developing countries to break down the wrong perception of developing countries. When we talk about developing countries, we talk about how people naturally think that they are incapable without any specific reason, and this perception is wrong. And in order for you to rectify this misconception, you give them an opportunity to prove themselves to the world that even though they're a developing country, they're capable of doing so. They're capable of running a decent tournament like what happened in South Africa and its World Cup. And because of these reasons, because I have proven to you how on the other side you allow the spirit of the sport to be carried out, you allow the exposure of cultures and therefore increases understanding in the world. But also I have proven to you lastly that because allowing international sporting events will rectify and allow the misconception to be clear, I am proud to oppose.
Right, thanks. Speech spoke 8 minutes and 45 seconds, 8:45. Invite first speech from government, please, ma'am.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we have an opposition who kept focusing on how that the economy, how the developed countries will intervene with the developing countries when they host sporting events. And when we said that this will lead to neo-colonialism, they said that it's not relevant at all. We, on Team Proposition, beg to differ. Today we had 3 criteria which we spoke about. We spoke about how it harms developing countries, how it harms the sporting events itself, and how it harms international relations. But all Team Opposition seems to have heard is how it harms the developing country economical wise. Today I have 3 clash points to deal with. The first one, will the countries actually get the money back? Second, how unity will not happen only in developing countries, but it's possible when these sporting events are held in other countries that unity can take place there too. And third, how neo-colonialism will exist. So moving on to my first clash point. Will the countries actually get the money back? Ladies and gentlemen, Team Proposition firmly believes that these countries will not get the billions of dollars they have invested to build stadiums and so many other costs which we have dealt with, and all this money will not come back, and that's what Team Proposition believes today. They spoke to us about how poor people will benefit, how poor people can set up stalls and hence will benefit. But what Team Proposition believes today is instead of spending billions of dollars into actually creating the sporting, this sporting event. They might as well help the poor people of that country by providing the billions of dollars, and hence will be better, and hence the country will become more developed instead of what the opposition does today. We also believe that only a false sense that the money will come back. We believe that the charges are taken with, sir. We believe that these costs will not stop after the sporting event is over. They spoke about how that these stadiums can be used later by other countries. We believe, by the people later. But we believe for this, renovation needs to take place. And for this is a further cost which they can be spending on developing their country instead of hosting this event in the first place. Yes, sir.
Are you criticizing developing countries hosting these international sporting events, or are you criticizing international sporting events in its whole?
Here.
The proposition believes today that these international sporting events are a huge cost, and this is something which no one can deny. We have to agree. But considering that there are millions of poor people in developing countries, this should be the burden of the developed countries to host, and hence the developing countries should not be allowed to host because it's a huge cost on them, which the developed countries can actually bear. Yes, like I was saying, they said that these stadiums can be used later by the people of that country. But ladies and gentlemen, we believe that for this to work, you actually have to renovate it. And hence, that is a further cost, and it is very difficult for the developing countries to for it to bear so much cost. And we would like to show you the example of China. China is currently tearing down the stadiums. What does this show? It is a huge cost. It is a huge cost to the country, and hence it is tearing it down, and hence it is taking a minimum, and hence it is a problem. Yes.
It's pretty unfair for you to only show us the cost when we also explain to you the benefits that these countries gain, such as like tourist activities and market activities increasing because of this.
The opposition today spoke about how media attention will be towards the poor, and hence they can somehow magically happen. But ladies and gentlemen, we gave you examples of how the poor people are shipped off from that place. So what will the media show when the poor people are not even existing in that place? Our second flashpoint is how unity does not happen only in developing countries. Team opposition spent a large time on explaining about how unity of different cultures and how people from all over the world will want to come to that country and see the culture. But ladies and gentlemen, we believe that this unity does not take place only in these developing countries, but this unity can exist even in developed countries. We believe that it's not necessarily the unity is not coming into place only because a developing country is hosting these international sporting events, but because a country is hosting a sporting event, which can be any country, even a developed country. And like we said, it would be easier if the developing country does not host a sporting event for various reasons, which we explained. We'll also, our next point was about neo-colonialism. We spoke about how neo-colonialism does take place.
China wouldn't have created better transportation system. It wouldn't have addressed the problem about its environment if it weren't to host Olympics.
You give us the example of China. We will tell you for the example of South Africa. They built underground transportation systems, which not many people are using right now, and this just shows it's a further cost which these countries shouldn't have paid back in the first place. Continuing, neo-colonialism takes place. We believe that when these developed countries intervene with the decisions taken by the developing countries, that there will be neo-colonialism taking place. We believe that they will expect some certain policy changes to take place, and hence neo-colonialism will take place, unlike what the opposition said today. We also feel that these developed countries are not simply going to help these developing countries host these sporting events, but in fact they will ask for help. They will ask for certain policy changes, either political or economic policy changes, and this will lead to neo-colonialism, and like the proposition stated clearly in our second speaker's point. Team opposition spent a large amount of time. No, thank you, sir. Team opposition showed a large amount of time speaking about how all the poor people will be benefited.
7 minutes and 47 seconds. 747. 747. Like the kind of speech from government, like to invite the opposition last speaker as well. Sir.
Now, just because I'm a girl and may have less potential to become a martial arts master than my male teammates here, that doesn't mean that I shouldn't practice jujitsu if I don't want to. What we see in today's debate is that the standard of being able to invest or continue to host an international event is not whether or not a country is a developed or a developing country. It's whether you have the qualifications that we already have today to actually host these events, whether you're allowed to have these facilities, whether you can maintain these facilities, whether you can have these facilities and build them so you can host that international event. Those kinds of things should be the standard that we should have in today's society, not whether a country is developed or developing. And we say in today's debate, we're going to prove 3 things. Number one, we're going to prove that these developing countries have the right to host these international events. Second of all, we've shown you that there will be benefits to the host countries. And third of all, the international community will benefit as a whole. And I'll show you this throughout my speech in 3 clashes. Number one, I'm going to examine whether there's a moral justification or any justification at all for not allowing these developing countries to host sporting events. Second of all, I'm going to question how exactly will this impact international sporting events in general. And third of all, I'm going to examine the social implications that will happen on an international and national scale. Now, starting off with our first clash, whether or not there's a justification for allowing these countries to host these sporting events. Now, the proposition told us these harms, right? About harms that come to the people, the harms come to the sporting events. Number one, they talked about the people, how the poor people, the rich and the gap between the rich and the poor will increase, and that these harms will be made to the people. Number one, we've shown you that these governments aren't irrational. They do a cost-benefit analysis when they have a certain host a certain international event. They know the costs, they know the benefits. We're not denying that there isn't going to be any cost. No, thank you, sir. There isn't going to be any cost when hosting these events. We've shown you, yes, there may be some short-term harms, but in the long term, in the long run, there are things that we can get more from these international events, whether it's economic or social benefits. We can gain both of that from actually hosting these international sporting events. We say that governments aren't irrational, no thank you, sir, and that it's not actually fair for the side proposition to only show us the cost of these things, when we've clearly showed you on our side where there are so many benefits, like tourist activities increasing, like market activities increasing, and etc. The proposition also agreed that in his first speech that these companies or these markets increase their market prices when these countries enter their country. So that's how they make money, ladies and gentlemen. In these cases, they can make even more profit when these hosts are being able to increase their profit through these market activities. I'll take it in a moment, sir. And they told us that how poor people will somehow become angry because they can't enjoy the benefits. I think poor people will become even more angry if their country isn't allowed to participate in these hosting events at all. Yes, sir.
You've now conceded that if that money is made back, it's made back by the big business running and operating within that country.
Okay.
It does not go back to the government, it does not go back to the people like it would if you didn't have your sporting events.
Right. They also questioned us how we're going to get this money back, right? Because the government isn't being handed the money back to these countries or these companies. Well, number one, the government doesn't, after a competition, other countries don't say, we had a great time in your country. Here's your money that you made for hosting this competition. It's dispersed to the people, it's dispersed to the markets that actually make the money for themselves, make the money that the people can get as an individual. That's how they make money. We say that the government can't be actually handed the money that they paid for this international event, but it's actually dispersed to the poor and dispersed to the people who actually need the money. So we say in that case, the poor people will benefit more from this hosting event itself. So we say in this case, the proposition side did not make a cost-benefit analysis on their side about how much benefit we can get from hosting these international events in a developing country. Now let's move on to our second clash about how exactly will this impact international sports in general. When I'm going to address the harms they mentioned about the sporting events, how there are going to be harms in the sporting events when developing countries somehow host these events. Now we've shown you today in our stance that we're not going to let these countries, some developing countries, just give them the hosting ability. We're not going to just force them to host these certain international sports events. We're saying that if they're qualified and meet all the standards that we need in order to host these events, yes, we will give them the power to host these events because they're qualified, they're chosen to make that decision. We've shown you so many examples of how there were successful international sporting events, such as South Africa, where they have increased tourist activities, market activities, and increased long-term benefits. No, thank you, sir. And we've shown you how it's worked in developing countries before. So we've shown you that there has been precedents about how these international sports events have worked beneficially and worked as well as other countries, like developed countries, that we show you the back infrastructure, that's not much of a problem if they meet our standards when it comes to qualifying for certain international sporting events. So we basically say that the harms mentioned by the proposition about how we'll have bad infrastructure, we'll have bad facilities for these people, we say that harm will not come under our standard or our model in today's debate. So we say in this case, it will actually benefit sports events because we're going to improve the spirit of these events. What they're saying, what the proposition is basically saying, is that we're not allowing poor countries to host these events because they're poor. When we say that it's not the spirit of events to actually exclude these kinds of people, exclude these groups of people. We say the actual idea, or actually the spirit of having these events, is for unification, to come together with national pride, to show them about your country and to show them the pride of that certain country. It's not about whether who's poor or rich, but we say if they're actually qualified to actually have these sporting events, then they should be able to host these events. They shouldn't be blatantly left out of that area just because they're a developing country or just because they're labeled a developing country. So we say it'll actually benefit these sporting events. Now the third clash, about the social implications that will happen on an international and a national scale. To the international scale, the proposition talked about the idea of neo-colonialism, right? That conspiracy theory that somehow these people, these countries will somehow become slaves of these other developed countries because they get politically influenced by these countries. Well, first of all, we say that this idea is enforced more on your side when you're not allowing these developing countries even to bid for these actual international sporting events. I'll take in a moment, sir. And second of all, we say, in that sense, why do you even allow these people to enter these international competitions in the first place? Because if you think that the country of a nation, its only responsibility is to take care of the poor and take care of the poor people in that country, you shouldn't be funding for your arts, you shouldn't be funding for anything, only trying to help the poor people in your society, right? Yes, sir.
Neo-colonialism is the influence of policy within a country, which comes about when they try to compete for bids and when thousands or millions of people flood to that country. Now, we do not change the policy in the country, you do.
Well, that's an assumption on your side because we say that if you're independently allowing yourself or allowing your country to able to host this kind of international scale event on your own as a country, we say that they have that right or they have that actual idea in the first place. We say that conspiracy theory, they talk about neo-colonialism, won't work in today's society because we haven't seen that happen until now. So, second of all, about the national scale, on the national scale, we say it will improve national pride. And say the reason that we have these sports events in the first place is to cheer on your country because you have pride in that certain country and to actually have a better unification with other countries and to expose your culture to other countries. They're basically taking away this kind of factor for these developing countries in general. We say that the proposition was only worried, they were so worried about the poor people and how to reduce the gap between the poor and the rich that they couldn't see the point in this debate. If you really want to decrease the gap between the rich and the poor, why not stop government funding for arts or sciences? Why not stop watching soap operas? Why not stop watching all these entertainment factors that we have? Because of course, according to the proposition, we need to spend all this money to the poor, right? We need to spend all that money to the poor. We say that the government makes a cost-benefit analysis when it comes to what's going to benefit our country, what's going to increase our national stance in the international world, and what's going to help our country later on in the future. We say we don't have a national government that does that, and because of these three clashes, we strongly beg to oppose. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Frank. The speech spoke for 8 minutes and 38 seconds. 8:38. Okay, that's in obstructive speech. We'll go to reply speeches. We start with opposition first, with the opposition first.
In a vacuum, their case would probably stand. But the problem here is that the entire case is not really a critique of international sporting events in developing countries, but rather saying that international sporting events in a whole are terrible and they should not exist. So the thing is this, it's not about saying that international sporting events are so terrible, they have so much cost, the infrastructure is not used, but it's also about saying why developing countries can't offset it, can't deal with it. Because if you're talking about the practical and economic aspect, which is the first issue of today's debate, they barrage you with a number of economic problems. The infrastructure won't be used, the poor people will suffer, and they will lose so much money, and billions of rands South Africa spent all went down the drain. The thing is, developed countries also face these problems. Their infrastructure rarely goes used, their poor people will suffer, and note here, developed countries do have poor people too, and even more so, they say that they'll lose a lot of money. Developed countries also face the same problem. The thing is, it does become a comparison between developing and developed countries and who really will suffer more. Because under developing countries, we told you, these guys have huge economic growth. They are able to offset these kinds of economic problems that come if they do exist with sporting events such as this. But developed countries have slower growth and they aren't able to offset the same kind of risk. Because developing countries trudge through. Even if they make a loss, there are so many other trading activities which are constantly spurring activities. And we told you this multiple times, but they ignored that. And we also brought you the example of Greece and South Africa and China. Intuitively, which country really suffered after hosting an international sporting event? Was it the developed country or the developing country? They would only like to focus on how it harms the developing country. But how about the developed countries too? They also too suffer. Why then are you saying we should not be able to give them the right to host sporting events because they think they might mess it up? When developed countries too can mess it up, developed countries, their poor people also suffer. Why does that in any sense make any sense? Because Greece is in economic crisis right now. South Africa, China, no, they're doing pretty well off. So the only difference thus is that developing countries have more poor people and these poor people will suffer even more. Fine, let's deal with that right now. So in terms of poor people, who helps more? They try to picture you the idea of poor people being shipped away because of these international sporting events, ignoring the fact that they cited Spain and Barcelona, which is a developed country, of where this happened. That's more the critique of developed countries shipping away these people. So okay, let's assume that developing countries do this anyway. Then what then is the best way to deal with the problem? We told you on slight opposition, with media scrutiny, with international coverage on these events, you get criticized whenever you do these kind of things. This is where help can come in, because you can't help people you don't know even exist. When we do know these poor people are being shipped away, we have international scrutiny. This is how we mold the country into accepting university accepted principles in terms of helping the poor. Then the second problem they had was the money isn't going to them. Let's spend all our money on developing the country, forgetting the fact that we have to have a certain balance in our expenditure. The thing is, all the money that's spent on this international sporting event, it isn't tangible when it comes back to us, but not everything we spend tangibly comes back to us. We told you that all this money trickles down. Of course the government won't get a huge wad of cash coming back to them, but rather they get things such as a sudden surge in businesses in the country, familiarity because people are exposed to the country, and this is especially important inside developing countries because their markets are new and not exposed. We told you this multiple times, but they never had the guts to respond to that. With this familiarity, people are more likely to invest in the country. That's how you spur international growth, economic growth, because sporting events are also a way of getting coverage of the country and getting people to come inside the country. And also job experience, people get this too. In conclusion, we may not see the money coming tangibly back, but in essence, there is economic benefit to the country. How can you deny them this right? Finally, this idea of neo-colonialism and this entire fuzzy idea. Thing is, it's like saying, we are afraid we might influence you, we are afraid you might be influenced, so let's make the decision for you to prevent you from hosting a sporting event. That's just ridiculous. And even if neo-colonialism happened, is it really that bad? Because they never told us the harms of it. In essence, we're very proud to propose. We say that developing countries are more than capable of hosting the events. They are the ones that reap a lot of benefit, and ultimately it's extremely bigoted to say they're incapable. We're very proud to oppose.
.424. Last speech to close the debate as the final.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, the side opposition has got very caught up on the difference between developed and developing. They have told you again and again, even used their entire reply speech, to emphasize that both developed and developing nations are qualified to do international sporting events. and that both receive the harms, or the same harms, that we've analysed. The problem with that being used as their strategy is that we completely agree. That is not what we told you in today's debate. We told you the problem is not that they're both qualified or that they both receive harms. The problem is that when the harms are received by developing nations, those harms mean they can't care for the millions of poor people they have to care for. Whereas developed nations don't have to care for those people. That is what we're telling you why their entire strategic line in today's debate completely falls. So I'm going to take this debate back to where it should be, which is the three criteria we initially set up in today's debate, and systematically show you why we win. So let's firstly look at developing nations. And the first thing I told you here was that they get economically harmed, and this has become a major clash in today's debate. So let me go layer by layer and show you why their analysis is just not true. So we told you that they have extreme cost. What was their first response? That there are lots of things like tourism and growth which make back this money. Well, we told you that those things are very short term, that they just don't make that much money back, which is why there were objections to the London Olympics from the people who were supposed to be getting the benefit. More importantly, growth simply means that you're getting towards a point where you're fully developed like developing nations. It doesn't mean anything. Growth means they're less able to cope with costs than developed nations. Not that they're more able to, like their reply speaker would seem to assert. Now, let's assume though that those are proper benefits, that tourism does exist and actually makes a difference. We don't think that that is able to recuperate costs. Why? Because they're so large. We think they spend hundreds of billions of rands or dollars on these kind of events, but they also continue. We think there is continuing cost to maintaining transport systems and stadiums, which simply isn't recuperable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be knocking down stadiums in China. More importantly, let's assume they win both of those levels. What we told you is that the major problem is that the money doesn't get back to poor people. Why? They told you that the money goes to broadcasters. That's true. Broadcasters, big business, not the millions of people living in slums in Brazil or in townships in South Africa. Those people do not receive benefit from big international sporting events. Basically, we told you that the much better alternative here is to take your money and put it into helping those people. Now let's talk about the other thing I told you in this, which was social cohesion. My point here was that when you've got Anglo created because poor people cannot access your sporting event, your society is broken apart. The only thing they could respond to that was an assertion that somehow the entire country suddenly gets a sense of national pride, even though when the event is actually in that country, the majority of those countries, the poor people, can't afford to buy tickets, can't afford to go to the restaurants that everyone else is going to, and can't afford to enjoy it. I appeal to you to understand how that's possible. How do they get the sense of national pride which brings the entire society together if they can't buy in? Basically, we feel strongly on our side of the house that that point falls to us. But then we look at other things, like the harm to sport, where basically all they said that our two levels, which was A, we can't get as good technology, and B, that people can't travel, don't matter, because what we're exposing people to is the culture of the country. That's all they could respond to. We, today, alongside our opposition, value the initial nature of those sporting events. We value the fact that they exist as more than just tools to try and attempt to grow an economy. We value the fact that fans should be able to get to them and enjoy safety while at them. We think that those points completely stand in today's debate and they haven't been rebutted at all. The last thing we have to look at is the international relations side of things. And what they told you here was that we were going to cost unity on an international level because these events create unity. Yes, they create unity, but not by being hosted by nations, simply by having nations attend them. So we get the same unity they do. What's the difference? Well, we have, through analysis of competition to get bids, shown you why we influence policy. That side of the house said that influencing policy is not that bad, we don't accept that, ladies and gentlemen. So on the three grounds, the fact that we harm the developing nations, and more importantly the poor people in them, that we harm the nature of the sporting events, and that we harm international unity, we are proud to propose.
I'd like to thank both teams. Six of you to join the debate. Please cross out your hands. The rest of us have to fill in the test and also the form as well, please. And you can get a seat in the front of the room.